All right, my name is Charles Duane Unrue. I spell that last name Unrue. I don't know why, but over the years, a lot of people have trouble spelling it and pronouncing it. But it is a good name. I was born in Elkhart, Indiana, which is in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. That's the northern part of Indiana, not too far from Lake Michigan. Elkhart, Indiana is an early settled town on the Elkhart River in northern Indiana. And I lived in Elkhart until I was about, I'm going to say 5 years old, and then moved to the little town of Syracuse, Indiana, which is also in Kosciuszko County. I may need to retract one previous statement. Elkhart, Indiana is in Elkhart County rather than Kosciuszko County.
Right. Now, were you born on a farm or in town?
I was born in town on Jordan Street in Elkhart. I've forgotten the street address, but it was about 3 to 4 blocks from Selmer, that's Selmer, Selmer Musical Instrument Manufacturing Company, which originally was formed in Paris, France, and moved to Elkhart. My dad became an apprentice at Selmer Musical Instrument Company when he was 19 years old. We lived on Jordan Street for approximately 3 years and then moved to Syracuse, Indiana, where we lived in a red house on Huntington Street. And it's in Syracuse where I went to grade school. And then my family moved way out in the Wild West to Abilene, Texas in, in 1940. At the time I was 11 years old.
And how old was your sister?
My sister would have been 9. And my dad came to Abilene on a trial basis for 6 months before he moved our family down. And he fell in love with the people and had a good paying job. He was foreman of the musical instrument repair shop for the H.N. White Music Company. And Mr. H.N. White was the son of the designer and builder of the King sterling silver clarinet. My dad was a very skilled craftsman. He was a hard, conscientious worker, and eventually he organized his own musical repair shop on South 7th Street, which is now near the new courthouse. He had that business for about 5 or 6 years, and he had a health problem as far as pain in his neck from bending over a workbench for so many years, And so he decided to move to Tucson, Arizona. And he and my mother loaded up a trailer full of his repair tools and took off for Tucson. Got out there and rented a house and set up his repair shop in the garage. And they knew one person when they moved to Tucson, and that was a fellow by the name of Johnny Sogorsk. And his wife, Mary, had been the secretary at H.N. White Music Company when my dad was there. And Johnny was in the Second World War and fought in the Philippines, and upon his discharge from the Army went to Tucson, Arizona, and became a city manager. Through that,
What year did they move to Tucson?
gosh,
You were out of high school, weren't you?
yeah, they moved to Tucson probably in about 19. I'm gonna say 1955.
Okay.
And like I say, they rented a house, and then in about 3 to 4 years, they had a house built. At that time, it was an adobe brick house with a wood-burning fireplace, double garage near a shopping center. Built it for the sum of $14,000.
Well,
The house was later sold about 20 years later for $70,000. So it shows you the
inflation
inflation.
anyway.
But
Well, let me back up a minute. So when you were in Indiana till you were 9 or 10, you said 11?
11 years.
So what do you remember, what did you like to do in Indiana?
Well, mostly fish. Fish and gardening. I was born a gardener and a fisherman. And when I lived in Syracuse, both my mother and dad worked. And after school, I'd get my bicycle and my cane pole and a can of worms and ride about half a mile down to Turkey Creek.
Okay.
And I caught bluegills, which are very delicious eating. I would, after I caught them, I'd clean them and bring them, or gut them and bring them home and scale them and clean them up good and put them in a bowl with a little salt and set them in our refrigerator. And then when my mother got home, she'd cook them for supper. And I've always loved to fish, and I still am in hog heaven when I'm fishing.
Did you know Ray Nichols then, or not? Did you did you go fishing with him or hunting or?
Ray Nichols was my grandpa, and when I was in Indiana back then, we didn't have a telephone. My grandparents did not have a telephone, so I couldn't call them and talk to them. So we would drive about, in the summertime, my parents would drive about, I think it was 55 miles to Kendallville, and I'd spend 2 weeks with Grandma and Grandpa Nichols, and you'd really get to know your grandparents that way. Today it's all the flip phones, smartphones, but no person-to-person relationship.
Right. So you were living in. You never lived on a farm in Indiana, right?
Not in Indiana. I'd go visit my grandpa
They were on a farm.
Unrue, who had two farms. As I recall, one of them was 60 acres, and I think the other one was 80 acres. But that was real rich, fertile land that grew the best looking corn he ever saw, and he also raised uh, alfalfa hay and let's see. Well, and then he had hogs, and he'd butcher hogs in the fall when it was cold, and made his own sausage and his own ham, and was very self-sufficient, real hard worker.
So, okay, so you moved from there, you moved here. What do you remember? Were you excited about moving, or did you think that was?
Oh, I thought it was a great adventure. I had a cowboy suit with real fur chaps and a vest and a 10-gallon hat and two cap pistols, and I wanted to see the real West, so I was looking real forward to it.
And then it was kind of a shock when you got here. Nobody had a horse or.
Well, we lived, when we moved to Abilene, we lived in a rent house on Ambler Street, which was across the street from Hardin-Simmons University, and the rent at that time was $7 a month. But my folks had to do a lot of cleaning and painting and everything, but the lot that house was on back in 1940 is now a beautiful park that is between several medical buildings because of proximity to Hendricks Memorial Hospital.
Okay, so when you told me that this afternoon you were born on the day of the Depression began.
The day the stock market crashed.
So what do you remember growing up? I mean, as a little kid, do you remember that? Anything about that, or?
I grew up in times of finding it difficult to have enough to eat. My dad was still working at Selmer's, and during I forget which year, but one winter he came down with scarlet fever, and our house was quarantined for, I believe, like a month. And during that time, we didn't have hardly much to eat, and so the fellow workers at Selmer plant all got together and took a collection and bought a ham and a bunch of lima beans, and they cooked up this big pot of ham and lima beans. And I never will forget hearing this knock on the door. I go to the door, there's a quarantine sign outside, so when I open the door, there's no person, but there's this huge, it seemed like a 50-gallon barrel, but I imagine it was more like, I don't know, maybe 5-gallon, but it was a big pot of hot steaming lima beans and ham.
Wow.
And that was a vivid memory. And another memory is up in that cold country in the morning when you go out to get the milk. A lot of times the milk had frozen and the cream pushed the cardboard lid up above the top of the glass milk bottle.
So you were a new kid in a new town, and who were the first friends you made, and
First friends I made, I guess my first friend was my old buddy Waldo Moutry. And I remember I had a red bicycle. It was a Hawthorne brand made by Montgomery Ward. And it had just regular red painted fenders. But my friend Waldo had the super duper bicycle with chrome fenders.
Ooh.
And the frame was chrome, and it had a bell that rang and a basket on it and a luggage carrier on the back. Mine didn't.
So are y'all about the same age? Were you?
We were exactly the same age, and the first summer after we moved here, my parents encouraged my sister and I to go to vacation Bible school up at the University Baptist Church, which was on North Ambler, or no, West Ambler, I believe it was. And then I was interested in Boy Scouting, and Waldo was already a Boy Scout, and he belonged to Troop 3 at the University Baptist Church. So I joined, and I ended up being the assistant patrol leader, and Waldo was the patrol leader. And our patrol was the Buffalo Patrol. And we'd go on, had a wonderful scoutmaster. His name was Rex Palmer. And I attained a rank of star and wanted to become an Eagle. But about that time, our scoutmaster was drafted into the Army, and our scout troop disbanded because there was no interested person to take over being scoutmaster. So my desire to become an Eagle never worked out, but I was a star.
Okay, so you're in like junior high. You're 11, 12 years old when you moved here, and that was about the time World War II was cranking up. What was it like? I mean, you were too young to be joining up like everybody else. What was that?
Well,
what do you remember thinking about that?
It was some pretty scary times. Camp Barkley was a very active Army camp out south of Abilene near Buffalo Gap. And the 36th Infantry Division and the 45th Armored Division, I believe that's correct, were stationed and trained at Camp Barkley. So when I moved here when I was 11 years old, and that was in 1940, and war was declared on December the 7th of 1941. And I was at Waldo Moutry's house when we heard the news over the radio that the Japanese had secretly attacked Pearl Harbor. And I was at his house helping him with some math problems. He seemed to have a problem with math, but I was helping him when we heard the news. And so back then there was the Texas National Guard, And then there was a Texas State Guard. And the Texas State Guard was organized for those that were too young to serve in the military and those that were too old. And Otis Claxton Sr. was the company commander of the Texas State Guard. At the age of 14, Waldo and I joined the Texas State Guard. We were issued regular Army uniforms, complete with helmet and backpack, and a 1917 Enfield 30-06 service rifle. And at the age of 14, I was promoted to the rank of corporal, and my job was a machine gunner for a 30 caliber Browning, a 30 caliber Browning water-cooled machine gun that was mounted on a tripod and had a water can on it that pumped water around the barrel so the barrel wouldn't melt.
Gosh. So what was the primary purpose of this group? Was it in case the U.S. got invaded, or
if what the deal was, there was a shortage of manpower in the military, and it was our job to Okay, John Bonnke was the second person that I met, along with another friend, Leroy Bell, who later became a very wealthy insurance agency. John Bonnke also had a chrome-plated bicycle. Not that mine was inferior, but I would have liked to have had a chrome-plated one. But John was, his dad was a paving subcontractor, a pioneer paving contractor in Abilene, and they had done a lot of the early highway paving in this area. He paved the West Lake Road and the East Lake Road years ago. But John and his dad both were in the Texas State Guard, and John and Waldo and I were all buddies, teenagers, but thought we were gladiator warriors.
So was that when the Jolly Boys started, or was that something else started later on?
No, the Jolly Boys were formed at Abilene High School during our senior year. And it was made up of about 10 different, well, I'll say they're well-mannered, good at heart, Christian type young men who stuck together for, oh gosh, I guess 50, 60 years.
And who thought of the name?
Borden Duffel came up with the name Jolly Boys. And back then that was a group that liked to have fun, and that wasn't gay boys, that was Jolly Boys.
And did y'all have fun?
We had all kinds of fun.
Was it all the kind of fun you'd tell your parents about, or?
Oh yeah, it was good, clean fellowship, and Of course, every once in a while we did like a beer or two, but uh, John Bunky's dad had a cabin out at Lake Fort Phantom, and the group would go out there quite often and spend the weekend and boating and fishing, and I usually ended up being the cook because I liked to cook. And even back then, I was making, as I recall, it was blackjack or might have been, anyway, it was pancake mix and that you'd add blueberries into and really made wonderful pancakes, and we have sausage and bacon to go with it, and lots of coffee and a lot of good fellowship. We'd play 42 and Monopoly was our big game back then.
So tell me about the when you decided to go to A&M.
Okay. My parents were not wealthy. They made a good living for my sister and I, but when I got ready to go to college, there wasn't student loans available at that time, and I went to Hardin Simmons for 1 year. That would have been 1947, I think. 40. Well, it would have been 47, 48. And when I took engineer drawing and math courses and made pretty good grades, and I was working part-time for the West Texas Utility Company for Mr. E.A. Hollowell. He was had the production department of West Texas Utilities, and back then practically all the employees of West Texas Utility Company were Texas Aggie graduates or Texas A&M, and Mr. Hollowell, I was acting as a draftsman, taking pencil drawings that they had of different documents and tracing them with India ink to make permanent copies. And one day Mr. Hollowell invited me to come into the office, and he said, Duane, have you ever thought about going to Texas A&M? And I said, well, I'd thought about it and would like to, but there's no way I can afford to go. My parents can't help me, and I don't have enough money to go. And he said, well, young man, just remember this. You can do anything that you set your mind to do. All you got to do is work. W-O-R-K. And I said, well, that makes sense. He said, if you want to go to A&M, I will write a letter to the head of the mechanical engineering department, and he's a friend of mine, and I will ask him if there's any way that that he can get me different jobs to earn my way through school. And as I recall, I believe his name was Mr. Stallings. And anyway, through that connection, I was able to get a job waiting tables in Duncan Mess Hall, which I did for 4 years, 3 times a day, and I had to get up at 5 o'clock and be on the job by 6. Then I was given the opportunity to have 2 candy and gum machines in the dormitory, which I kept stocked with gum and candy, and I got a 10% commission off of all sales. And I had a bank account and saved it. And then on ball games, I sold Cokes and hot dogs out of a cold drink stand and made pretty good money at that. And then my senior year, I was given the managership of an entire stand that sold Cokes and hot dogs and all kinds of candies and gums. And anyway, I earned enough money my senior year, along with what I had saved from my other jobs, that when I graduated from A&M, I owed them $600. And I paid that $600 back within a year. So I feel like I got as good an education by doing that than I did from what I got out of my books. My major was industrial education with an industrial technology option. And when I got into the Army, I was officially assigned the well, it's called military occupational specialty. I was a safety engineer, but I was assigned to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland, which is the headquarters for the Army Ordnance Corps Research and Development. And I was trained as a ammunition supply and renovation officer. And I must have done something right, because they kept me there for 6 months as an instructor. And the Korean War was going on, and there was 12 in our class, and 6 of the 12 went directly to Korea, and of that 6 that went, only 3 came back. And fortunately, my assignment as an instructor there kept me from going to Korea until January of 1953. I stayed in Korea 2 years and then was assigned back to the United States to the Army Ordnance Guided Missile School in Huntsville, Alabama. And while there, my first assignment was the executive officer of the headquarters and headquarters detachment of the guided missile school. And then I was promoted and given the assignment of chief of the propellant explosive branch of the school. And it was in its infancy, and at that time I was instrumental in helping writing a field manual on propellants and explosives for ordnance guided missiles.
Now, when you were in Korea, what was your primary job?
My first assignment, well, let me backtrack a little. They needed someone with my training in a hurry, because the condition of most of the mortar rounds and artillery rounds were in bad shape due to the bad storage conditions in South Korea due to the humidity of all the rice paddies. And anyway, instead of sending me to Korea on a military plane, they chartered a Canadian Pacific airliner that I was a passenger on that flew direct from, I believe it was Fort Lewis, Washington, to Tachikawa Air Base in Tokyo, Japan. I was there for 3 days and put on a ship and went from Japan to Busan, South Korea. Immediately upon arriving there, I was put on a troop train, traveled at night, and we were given orders to not light cigarettes, turn on flashlights, or even light a cigarette lighter, because the train we were on was just wooden box cars, and you're sitting on wood seats. And 2 nights before the trip I made on up to Yongdong-po, there had been a North Korean sniper take shots at this train. So we were very conscientious in those lads. And we arrived at Yongdong-po, which is a personnel replacement center. And from there I was assigned to the 83rd Ordnance Battalion, which is part of the 3rd Army. And General Maxwell Taylor was the commanding general of that 3rd Army.
Okay, so you at the end of your, was it, how long were you in the Army? 4 years?
Well, I was in Korea 2 years, and then I was assigned to the Ordnance Guided Missile School in Huntsville, Alabama, and that's where I became head of the propellant explosive branch.
Okay, so when was it that you got married? Was that
I got married in, as I recall, it was, I think it was June the 1st of 1955.
And where did you know Jean?
What?
You knew Jean from high school?
Right. I went to high school with her, and she was in my Sunday school class at St. Paul Methodist Church, and used to go over to her house to square dance. Her mother and dad liked to square dance, and they'd move the furniture out of the living room and roll back the carpet, and would square dance. And went on Sunday school picnics, and the Charlie B. and Zan had this ranch down at Brook Smith, and on occasion another girlfriend of mine, Linnell Lucas, she never was a serious girlfriend, but she was a good friend. Anyway, she and I and 2 or 3 others would be guests over the weekend down at Dom Idget, which is a little old cabin on a tank or water tank on the Carr Ranch at Brook Smith, Texas. And while I was in Korea, there was a great need for food and clothing for the Korean children who were orphans, and we had 2 Korean houseboys at our bachelor's office quarters, which was an old house that had been fixed up, and these two Korean boys. One of them's name was Abel, and let's see, John and Abel, and they did not have very warm clothes, and the winters would get below zero. And I would write Jean, and she would get together with her Sunday school class, and they sent, as I recall, it was 5 big boxes full of used coats and socks and underwear and all kinds of stuff, as well as toothpaste and personal hygiene. Anyway, the class sent these 4 big boxes over there, and somewhere I have pictures of the 2 houseboys in their warm clothes with a sign they had that said, "Thank you very much."
So how did during all that time, how did the going to work for CB Oates Construction Company come about? Were you married before that, or was that part of the deal?
Well, I married Jean Oates. Well, after we married, I was still had it in my head for a military career, because I really enjoyed it, and not bragging, but I was good at it, and had all kinds of employment opportunities for guided missile related manufacturing companies. But anyway, one day I got a letter from CB Oates on very poor typing, but you could make it out eventually. And in that, he offered me the opportunity to learn the construction business. And I thought about it a long time. Your mother was pregnant with you at that time. I believe you were born in 57, weren't you?
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, we decided that I would take Charlie B up on his offer and learn the business, because I was pretty good at math. I was won 2 awards of merit in high school for mechanical drawing, and could read blueprints real well, and I enjoyed that part of the business, and this seemed like an ideal opportunity to learn the business, and I did.
So you did that for how many years?
Well, I started in 1957 and retired in 1991.
So that's
So 57,
33 years.
Yeah. It was around.
34 years.
Yeah, 34, active 34 years.
So here's a good one for you. What was the most satisfying and most frustrating part of the construction business?
Well, the frustrating part was the long hours that I had to work. I wasn't an 8 to 5 man. I did for years, I did all of our cost estimating to prepare our bids that we would make on mostly commercial jobs. And my partner at first, Fred N. Busby, who was a very capable construction superintendent, would handle the work in the field, and I would do the estimating and office work and handle the finances and purchase the materials and make sure they were delivered on time. I was the get it done guy.
That's kind of that's what you raised too. I became the get it done guy. So what was the most satisfying part of that?
Well, the most satisfying part of it, I guess, was the experience I had when I bid the Fine Amy Graves Ryan First Student Center at McMurray College, or the Fine Arts Center. I'll correct myself. Back then, I didn't have any help in the office. I was doing all the estimating. The job was to be bid at 10 o'clock one Thursday morning. And in the bidding process, you will get quotations either by fax or by telephone or by mail up until 10 minutes before bid time. And since I didn't have any help, I had to put this $1 million bid together and sign all the documents, bid bonds and the bid forms, and make sure I had everything filled out correctly, and be at the job letting at 10 o'clock on this Thursday morning. And I was signing my name and finishing the last bit of the bid papers at about 10 minutes before 10. I knew I did not have enough time to get in my vehicle and find a parking place, and the bid was to be taken in the administration building, in the boardroom. So after I got everything together, I ran out the front door of the office, across South 14th Street, down the campus to the administration building, practically out of breath. And when I walked in and handed my bid to the architect, it was 2 minutes till 10. They read the bids out, and I got the job by $1,900.
Wow.
So that was a lot of hard work, but it paid off.
Right. Tell me the story of how the farm came to be.
Well, as you know, I was in the military, and back then there was a law that if you were a veteran, you could borrow $10,000 on a 40-year note at 2%, I believe it was 2% interest. It may have been 4%. I believe it was 4% interest. And I decided that I wanted to farm. I always was interested in pecan trees and planting and harvesting wheat, because I'd done it when I was a little kid. And so I got a realtor and had him look. I was looking for something out south of Abilene, out around the hills, because I knew there were deer out there, and I'd have a place I could deer hunt. And this realtor said, "I've found the exact place you need." He said, "There's a guy that works for ACO Feed Company. His name is Barney Thurman. And Barney is in debt, and he's decided he's going to sell his farm to get out of debt. And he's asking $100 an acre for that farm. There's 54 acres. And I said, well, okay, I'd like to do it. And then Barney hawed around. He said, well, I'm going to have $110 an acre or I won't sell. I didn't argue one bit. So I borrowed, I think it was, I believe it was around $5,900 that I borrowed, but it was going to take something like 3 months to get everything, paperwork done, and I didn't want it to slip away from me, so I asked Charlie B. if he would loan me the money, and the title would be in his name until I could pay him back. And anyway, he loaned me the money, and we closed the deal, and I paid over the years. I paid it off. I did a lot of improvements on the farm with the help of my grandson, Brian Baker. I planted over 300 pecan trees, and that was my love and joy for years and years. And the idea was that by the time I reached retirement, I'd have a good retirement income off of pecans. Well, everything went great for about 10 to 15 years, and then we ran into 7 years of severe drought. My water wells dried up, very little rainfall. I couldn't haul enough water to water all those trees. The drought was so bad that 100-year-old pecan trees at Abilene State Park died.
Wow.
So you know it was severe. But I saw a dream and a lot of work just go down the drain, but there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
And I became so disappointed and distraught that it worried me so bad every time I went out there and saw all the dead trees that I decided to put it on the market and sold it.
So you built the house out there, the cabin.
I built a house. As I recall, it was it's 2-story. It was close to 2,000 feet. It was a nice home, and that's where I was planning on retiring. But then Jean, my wife, passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, and my world was turned upside down, and I decided to sell it, and had a lot of good memories. But
There was a lot of things that happened at that farm.
Yeah.
A lot of family gatherings, and you know, you wouldn't have had that great picture of me sitting on the fence, or Ann sitting on the fence.
Yeah. Right.
So, okay, tell me the. I mean, I've heard this before, but tell me the about the story of how you and Duane met.
Oh, well.
And how you finally convinced her to.
All right. My wife and my first wife and the mother of all my children died on October the 6th, 1983, of a massive heart attack. And it was a horrible experience to go through, and I really, really was heartbroken, and was faced with what to do with the rest of my life. And unfortunately, I remarried my wife's best friend, quote, who turned out to use me as a financial gain because I was easy pickings and subject to being taken advantage of. But anyway, I'd rather not discuss that marriage.
I didn't ask.
And I still had the farm at this time, and I had this divorce. It took a long time to get it, but anyway, I divorced Helene Tutt, and she took me for over $20,000 plus a $5,000 ring. And anyway, I was really heartbroken over that. I guess more, well, felt deserted, so to speak. And I was out at the farm on a Saturday picking pecans up. This was before the drought. And I just broke down, and not ashamed to say that I cried and cried and cried. And I came in, and my daughter Carol, who was 13 at the time of Jean's death, was visiting relatives, and I was home in a empty, cold house, and just really was shook up. And I got down on my hands and knees in front of a green couch that we had at that time, and cried out to the good Lord, why have you forsaken me? Why have I had to go through all this? And prior to this, I had been going to Al-Anon to try to get over the sorrow of the divorce. And there was a counselor whose name was Penny. I can't think of all of her name now, but anyway, she was. Okay. Well, anyway, Penny told me about this friend of hers that had been attending a Overeaters Anonymous program, who was really an attractive young lady, who was a divorcee that had had a bad divorce, and that she was really a wonderful Christian lady, and she had the most beautiful hands. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And but the point of my story is that when I cried out to God about being forsaken and why I had to go through all this, there was not an audible voice, but my conscience, I guess you'd say, answered the problem. And that, number one, I'd not been forsaken, and number two, You get up early Sunday morning, put on your toupee, put on your pinstripe suit, and go to St. Mark's Episcopal Church. Penny had told me about St. Mark. Well, that's what I did. And I didn't know what Duane looked like or who she was or anything. But I went to the back door of the church because the sermon was in process. And I walked in the back door, and there was a fellow standing there. His name was Tommy Thompson, I believe it was. And he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, do you know Duane Flournoy?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, she's in Sunday school class. You want me to go get her?" And I said, "Oh, no, wait a minute. I just wanted to know if you know her." And it was the custom of St. Mark's that every Sunday they'd have dinner there, which in Fellowship Hall, which was really a neat deal. And not the pastor, but the head of St. Mark's at that time was oh gosh, I'm trying to think of his name. Anyway, he was really a great guy, and I'll think of his name in a minute. But anyway, about that time, Sunday school was over, and all the classes were coming to Fellowship Hall for this dinner. And Thompson said, "That's her right over there, that little short gray-haired lady." And I said, "Well, would you mind going over and telling her that there's someone that would like to talk to her?" And he said, "Sure." And he goes over and says, "There's somebody here that wants to talk to you." And so he motioned me over, and Charles Chatham was the name of the pastor of the church. Anyway, Duane I looked down at her, and she looked up at me, and she said, "Well, do I know you?" And I said, "Well, no, you really don't, but there's a mutual friend of mine that wanted us to meet." I was sort of a fast operator there. And so anyway, Duane said, "Well, would you like to have lunch with me?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sure." And we had a lovely lunch and discussed just things in general. And after lunch was over, she said, "Well, would you like to go to the service with me?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sure." But I was a Methodist, and I didn't know anything about Episcopalian ritual. And she coaxed me on how to kneel before you go into the pew, and the prayer book and all that. And so she led, and I would kind of follow along. And anyway, we had went through the service, and then afterwards we visited a while, and then she gave me her phone number. Not that she was being forward, but I gave her my phone number and she hers, and we started talking to each other once or twice a week on the phone. Then we decided, how about meeting at church on Wednesday night at choir practice, and we could just sit on the bench and visit. And we did that for, 2 or 3 months, I guess, and just talk about all kinds of things. And in the Episcopal Church, if you're a divorcee and want to remarry, it's against church doctrine to marry sooner than a year. After divorce, you have to wait at least a year. Well, Duane had been divorced for 2 or 3 years, but I was just going through a divorce, and the bottom line is, I think this was in September that we first met, and by Christmas I was well impressed enough to buy a James Avery gold cross and chain, which I did, and that kind of impressed her. But anyway, it's turned out to be a wonderful 27 years of marriage.
I did forget one Jolly Boy question I forgot to ask you. You were telling about when the Jolly Boys started. How did the Jolly Boys reconnect when everybody came back as grown-ups?
This is going back to the Jolly Boys. All right, the Jolly Boys was organized in high school. Then after high school, all of us went either off to college, or we went in the military. There were some in the Air Force, some in the Marines, some in the Navy. I was Army, of course, and some in the Air Force. And over the years, we finally all came back to Abilene, and must have been something good about Abilene because everybody came back. And after they did, well, we decided to get together and form a supper club where we'd bring a potluck. We'd do it once a month, and we'd all bring a dish of something. We had potluck supper, and we'd play 42 or Scrabble or all, and just had the best of times, and had little kids. With the little kids, we had a nursery co-op, a babysitting co-op,
Yeah.
where we'd trade out. You got points for keeping some of the Jolly Boy kids, and anyway, it just was wonderful, and it continued until everybody has died off.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, I think I'm the only one left.
Were the new Jolly Boys, were they the same people, or did y'all add some people that other people knew?
There were
or
some that came and went. For instance, Duane Nash was a Jolly Boy, but after he married his wife, she was a social climber and didn't think we were
I'll be
high
sure to put
enough
that in.
society. You can edit that. And we had
I mean, were all these people like John Easter and all those guys from high school?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
I did not know that.
yeah. They were all high school.
So, what I need to know, I need you to tell me about how you ended up purchasing the cabin, what led to the idea up there, how you found it and all that stuff, and then how you found out years later that you were buying it from John Goodloe and didn't know it.
Yeah, okay.
And
all right.
all that.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. This is about how Duane and Duane Unrue cabin came about in Arbalise, Colorado. In you still with us?
Yep.
In the year of 1973, I was under contract to build a Bonanza restaurant in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I was working for an owner whose name was Johnny Bunch, who was a retired Air Force officer and had a private plane. And he and I got in his, I believe it was a Cessna, or it could have been a Piper Cub. Anyway, we flew up to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and rented a car and drove to the site to where this restaurant was to be built. And we looked at the site, and Johnny showed me all the details, and we went over the plans and everything. And then we flew back to Abilene, Texas, and we were not all that far from Colorado. And when we got home, I decided I was going to take another trip back up there to do some more work on the site. And I went back up there, and while I was there, I decided I'd heard about Navajo Lake in Arbalise, Colorado. So I had a little extra money and decided I'd go up there and look around and maybe buy some property. And I got up there and was really impressed with the beauty of the countryside and the deer and birds and all the wildlife and everything. And went to a realtor by the name of Bob McKelvey, who had a real estate office there near the store. And he showed me some land that was available. There were 7 lots altogether. It amounted to about 4 acres of land. And at that time, it was offered to me, as I recall, for $10,000. And in that market, it was a bargain price. And Bob McKelvey was working for the Piedra Park Development Company, who one of the partners was John Goodloe. And
so this was in 1973?
In 1973.
Wow. So that was
and
a few years before I knew anybody in the Goodloe family.
It looked like a good deal, so I bought the land and got a loan at the Burns National Bank in Durango, and paid $100 a month for 10 years and got it paid off. And after I decided to retire and had married my wife of, I believe, what now, 37 years. Anyway, Duane encouraged me to go ahead and build my cabin that I dreamed of for years. And so in 1991, I took Ricky Martinez, who was my best job foreman, and one carpenter and two laborers, and they came up to the property with the company pickup, and they had all their saws and tools and everything, and I pitched a tent for them, and we had two tents. They all lived in tents, as I recall, for 5 weeks. And Duane came up on the bus, because she was still teaching school. She came up on the bus, and we stayed in the mobile home that I had hired to be pulled all the way from my farm in Abilene. And we had this Broadmoor mobile home that we set up and had the site prepared before the trailer got there, and all the site work on the property was done by a dirt contractor by the name of Virgil Taylor. He and his son did a great job in leveling off a hillside and building an access road, and setting a 500-gallon propane tank that I'd hauled all the way from the farm in Abilene up to the property. And anyway, in a period of 5 weeks, Ricky and his crew built a real good-looking roof structure over the trailer, and we had a front porch that was 60 foot long and 10 foot wide, which was later converted to living areas, and we used log siding to make the building look like a cabin. And we needed a fireplace, so Ronnie and Mary Jean Baker brought their family up, and we dug the foundation for the fireplace and poured it. And then a year later, I had a stonemason come up whose name was Cecil Smith, I believe. And anyway, he and his son came up and brought their equipment and built this beautiful fireplace out of native rock. And my grandson Brian Baker helped me gather the rock to build the fireplace, and it was completed in August of 1991. And ironically, the person's name who was signed on the contract for the purchase of the land was John Goodloe, who years later, many years later, became well, his daughter became my daughter-in-law, and my son Bruce married Ann Goodloe back in what year?
80.
In 1980. So talk about a odd sequence of events. That was it.
So you've had the cabin since 1991. 91.
Yes.
So during that time, approximately how many times a year have you gone up there?
Since 91, I've probably, if you averaged it out, I would say at least once a year, but as often as possible, twice a year.
And you've had all your family members and
yes,
all kinds of other guests come up there.
We've had several guests up there. all of my sons and daughters have visited up there over the years, and we've gone boating and fishing and camping and really communicated with labor, and it's been a lifetime uh, desire and goal that was completed through farsightedness, planning, and hard work.
All right. That's probably